Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what is almost the last event of this wonderful weekend. If you're planning on participating in the children's activities that you saw out in the lobby, you have one more stop. But otherwise, this is it. My name is Paul Neely. I have the honor of serving as a trustee of the Clark. For the last several years, I've been chairman of the Trustees Committee on Buildings and Grounds, and thus chair of the smaller group overseeing roughly this project. We are delighted that it is in essence coming to a close. But we're also proud that the Clark now has a campus, 2 new buildings and 2 major renovations over the last 10 years that measures up to the Clark's status and standing in the art world and reputation as just a wonderful place to be. We're going to start off with just a few minutes. I'm going to race through a few slides here rather quickly to give you an idea of what went into some of the renovation work, most especially where you're sitting. This is just to give you an idea of all the expertise that has to come into play on this sort of thing. Some of these people have been around here for most of the last 10 years. And some of them have been here this weekend. I mean, it was surprising to some of us, some people who came back from places like Chicago who had been involved, but were so proud to be part of the project. So this is what the auditorium used to look like. To remind you of the attractive green carpet there. That was a ramp looking up that way. I have pushed a friend of mine in a wheelchair up that ramp. It did not meet code. It was steeper than ever intended. As you see, there are no handrails at that point. That's the balcony where there's one handrail on one side and the lighting on the wrong side. That also failed to meet code. The 3 steps here in front of the stage were wonderful for people going back and forth between the audience seats and the stage, which often happens in the scholarly conferences here. If you're in a wheelchair, they were a barrier. And in fact, if you were in a wheelchair and needed to get to the stage, you had to go outside and around a side entrance, which also did not meet code. That was an emergency exit that did not meet code. That's the back door to the stage. That ramp was too steep. So at the beginning, we got into this kind of detailed planning where you draw and figure out the sight lines that are involved. See if anybody's going to wind up with a worse seat if you change the angle of these ramps on the side. What we did in that space there used to be a handicapped accessible restroom. We moved that up to, in essence, where the entrance to the old cafe was, and created a hallway that's now behind this wall. And one can enter underneath the green exit sign here, and there's a small 40-inch lift that will take you from one level to the other, so that if you were down in an access seat like that, you could get in there and be on stage level without going outside. This, in fact, is not the sort of thing they would let you build from scratch, but they gave us a variance because it met the functionality that was required. We have accessible seating areas sprinkled around here. One of the modern features of the disability codes is that you don't create a so-called wheelchair ghetto where everybody in a wheelchair is in the same place. In fact, you spread them around so that people accompanying them can sit next to them. This is where we built the new accessible bathroom, and that is the 40-inch elevator that's behind that green exit sign. That's up in the balcony area. You can see we've added handrails and lighting in the center of the steps. This is a trench that when the place was emptied out was dug from the far corner back there to down here. And that allowed us to put in new electrical capacity, including some empty conduits, so that people with fancy electronic equipment can come just feed their lines through there. And if you were at the concert here last night, they did that. There was a sound guy working a control board back in the back, and he said it had been a snap. In the old days, we used to have to run those cables, again, against code, along the chairs or whatever worked. This is the kind of thing we'd get into with the building inspector, for whom we have a high professional respect. But we were trying to get some walls done in the thaw gallery, which you may have seen out there, and he couldn't get here for a few days, but he allowed us to leave this hole so that he could come see and make sure that the inside was treated properly. And then we just had to seal it up after he approved of it. That is an example of how we got into a very good working relationship with him, based on a lot of experience and what came to be a high trust and regard for each other. He made this a better building than it would have been. So this is what this room looked like at its worst. This was nothing but full of scaffolding. All the seats had to be replaced because we could not document that the upholstery was fireproof. That's new carpet being laid. Each of those little holes was where a seat would be replaced. And gradually it came together. The wooden baffle up here on the ceiling had always been there. Some of the speakers up there didn't work, hadn't worked for years. And you'll see, I don't know if I can highlight them, but in these bare panels here, you'll see some round wooden things about 3 inches wide. That's where we had to install fire sprinklers. You can imagine the engineering that went into putting fire sprinklers into that feature. And we did similar work on the outside so that every entrance had a hard surface. The curtain is new. It began to shred as we took it down for construction. And just a few of the people, your friends and neighbors, who made this happen here. That was our construction manager. Bill Powers runs the indoor facilities here. Tom Mahar ran a function where we paid him, but he was responsible in a professionally ethical way for maintaining meticulous records for both the contractor's benefits, our benefits, and the building inspectors. Again, part of the whole trust process. And finally, Tony King, whom a lot of you don't know because Tony runs the non-art portions of the museum. And he's been here a long time. 2 years ago, we went to Tony and said, we're worried about dollars and time, and you're in charge. And we handed over the responsibility on both those scores, and the last 2 years have gone, especially compared to earlier years, have gone splendidly, and I hope you're happy with all the results you've seen this weekend. Now, there was one part of the building that I was really worried about getting done on time. During his year of distinguished service as interim director, we had most of the professional staff here was not allowed in the building. It was an active construction site. So we rented space, including over in the old Grand Union building behind the Cumberland Farms convenience store on Main Street. Frank Oakley, in his own charmingly self-deprecating way, often noted that his office was in the produce section. I knew I could count on his sense of humor. I had not met Olivier yet. I wasn't sure about that. So I said, guys, I'll tell you what, one corner we have to have done is the director's suite of offices. And sure enough, as you can see, it got done in plenty of time to put the books in a neater order than that office has seen in a couple of decades. And that is Olivier pretending to be at work. As some of you know, Olivier came to us from Dallas, where he'd been since 2009. The voice you will hear is not a Texas twang. Olivier came from France. He worked at the Louvre from 1993 until 2009. Now, he also spent 1 year here. He and his wife, Laure, were in the first class of Clark Fellows here and spent a year in Williamstown and formed a real attachment for the community that has served us well now in getting him back. I think the proper greeting when you meet him is welcome home. We are more than delighted to have him here. Now, the natural question is, his background, you know, at the Louvre was Spanish, American, and British art. But here's a guy, you know, more than half his life spent in France. Why is he going to talk to us today about British art? Well, first, we are honoring the generosity of the Manton family here, which began with a magnificent collection of British art, and a collection that wasn't just wonderful in its own right, but really broadened and deepened the reputation of the Clark as a substantial, major museum, not just automatically thinking about French Impressionists. Secondly, as I said, at the Louvre, he had been in charge of Spanish, American, and British art. During that time, he wrote 2 books on J.M.W. Turner, certainly a central figure in British art. And he's still a member of the editorial board of the British Art Journal in London. I suspect I could have chosen probably 6 or 7 different countries and found parts of his resume to document his expertise in each of them. But he has a really impressive knowledge, broad knowledge of art. We had a board meeting this weekend, half of Friday and all day Friday and half of Saturday, which was the first time that he met with us as a board. In his full capacity, he visited us in August. And I'll tell you that we left the board meeting greatly heartened. You know, we had made the right decision. I think he will be a great leader for this institute, and we're going to keep him. Please join me in welcoming Olivier Meslay.
Twice. And then I think. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. If I. Oops, I tried.
Okay, come on, what's going on? Sorry. There.
Okay, good. Thank you, John. But well, thank you first, thank you, Paul.
I'm very grateful for your introduction, but more important, we are all very grateful for the amazing job you did during the last years at the head of the Building and Ground Committee. Without your commitment, your knowledge, your diplomacy and determination, nothing better probably than this combination, we would not be here today celebrating the completion of the entire campus. Paul is an amazing trustee. I would like to take the opportunity also to express my gratitude to other volunteers here at the Clark. The docents and volunteers during the weekend worked hard to welcome and help our public. This was a true success, I think, and I want to thank them. But we celebrate many things with the completion of the Manton Research Center. Inside the Manton Research Center, you find offices for the staff. You saw one of them, the largest one, honestly. I think there is no other director's office in the world as large as this one. The library, the research and academic program, the Williams Graduate Program, the Eugene Thaw Gallery, and the Manton Study Center for Works on Paper. But there is also, and it's the topic of today, a large gallery dedicated to British art and to the Manton collection. This collection is now a signature for the Clark and one of its strongest identity. But I would like to put this collection in perspective in the Clark history and reflect on its role. As Paul said, I have a little bias. I've been in charge of British art at the Louvre for 17 years, and I think for me it was a way to come back to something I really like and love. But before that, I would like to, as we are in an inauguration mode, I cannot resist to look again at the inauguration of the 1950 museum building by Sterling and Francine Clark. You probably know this footage, but I think it's always good to see that, because I will start to talk about Sterling and Francine Clark collecting lightly, but collecting British art. I like the way Sterling is taking his hat out. I think it's a very strong movement. But as you can see here, there is no British art on view in the footage. But I would like to start with the portrait of Sterling Clark by Sir William Orpen. Sir William Orpen was an Irish artist, and Sterling Clark picked him in 1921, 1922. That is the date of when the portrait was painted. And it's a beautiful portrait. In fact, we all look at this portrait, and I looked at this portrait since many years without really looking at it. It's a beautiful portrait by an artist I like, which is Sir William Orpen. You can see detail that indicate not such an official and straight portrait. You have, of course, Sterling is very proper. He is in a chair, probably a Louis XV chair, but he has lightly violet shirt, beautiful tie, and a very strong and striking yellow cushion on it, on his back. So William Orpen was, and it's an interesting pick for Sterling Clark, because William Orpen was an Irish artist who went to the Slade School in London at the end of the 19th century and started to work as a portraitist, but the moment he really raised his status was during World War I. He became an amazing war painter. It's a very strange concept, because in fact only the British has been very good at that. There is a lot of things to say about this practice, but I would like to show you two paintings by William Orpen, during World War I. This one which is made at the end of the war, and it's called The Mad Woman of Douai. Douai was a town which has been captured, bombed by the German, and this lady, who is in fact in shock, probably since many days, is surrounded by people from the town. You see the town completely destroyed on the back, and you see also British soldiers looking at her in a very odd way. It's a sort of surrealist, before surrealism scene. And on this one, you have Open himself, Ready to Start. It is the name, the title of the painting, Ready to Start, 1917. And it's a beautiful and moving painting when you think about all these people were going back to the trenches, as Open was doing. He was visiting trenches to paint them. And he had this very, not fancy, but extravagant dress, which is probably a goat coat, and with the casque, and on the back there is flowers, and there is this sort of contradiction between going back to the trenches and being, in fact, and painting himself and not knowing probably if he will be back. But I think I wanted to make this introduction about Sterling Clark and this portrait that we do not see, in fact. We see it, but we do not look at it. And I think it's important to, look at it again, and you will see that it's a very strong painting. But then we all know that Sterling Clark was more, and Francine were more interested by French art than by British art. But they bought some paintings that are very important in the collection, and some objects also that are very important. And the first one is Paul de Lamery, one of the great Huguenot silversmiths working in London, which is one of the masterpieces by him. We have also this beautiful double portrait of the Linley children. The Linleys were these young friends of, the parents were friends of Gainsborough when Gainsborough was in Bath. Bath was a sort of a resort town in England, and Gainsborough always chose to go to Bath instead of staying in London, where his competitor, main competitor Reynolds, was in fact having a more dignified atelier, studio, and he was painting in a very different way. Gainsborough was more intimate, and these are two of the children of the Linleys. One, Thomas, became a violinist, and Elizabeth became a singer. Beautiful, also very intimate portrait of Sir Thomas Lawrence, by Sir Thomas Lawrence, of the Honorable Caroline Upton. Then something which is interesting when you will compare this, keep this painting in mind when we will go back to the Manton collection and to go back to Constable. It is one of the very few painting. Jay was giving a lecture, a talk an hour ago, which almost ruined my entire talk, on the Manton collection. Thank you, Jay. But she was saying that, and it's true that it is one of the very few depictions of a grand house by Constable. And it's interesting because Sterling was grand in many ways, picked this sort of Constable instead of picking what Sir Edwin Manton picked later, that means the depiction of humble houses. But it's a beautiful painting. It's one of the really great paintings by Constable. He did many views of the house. There is one almost comparable, almost exactly the same at the Louvre. Then there is another Constable, which is the view of Salisbury, which is also very different from the one Sir Manton picked for his own collection. Salisbury, this one is from 1821. The one in the collection here is 1829. Salisbury, I will go back to this later on why Gainsborough went there, Constable went there. But it's one of the very few places that Constable depicted outside what is called now Constable County. And then you have the beautiful Turner. But again, it's interesting to keep that in mind when you go back to the Manton's Turners. This is from 1840. Another Turner from the Clark collection, bought before 1955. There is few English painting, above all when you compare with the French holdings in the Clark collection. But they are very good. Very few, but very good. But also very specific in comparison with what we will see in the Manton collection. Then, the building of the Manton Research Center, 1972 by Pietro Bellucci. Nice views with nice cars. The Clark continued to buy British art. Some very extravagant British art manifestation like this, the Alma Tadema piano, and Cathy Morris is preparing this exhibition on the piano and why the piano was made there, for which purpose, for which room, and I think the recreation, not in a period room way, but the recreation of the music room of Mr. Mark Wand in New York will be, I think, stunning. And, but it's one of the real masterpieces of decorative art in British art. Then we received also gifts sometimes, one by one. This one is a very interesting Arthur Davis. Arthur Davis was an early painter at the beginning of the 18th century who in fact started he was the first one really to make this, what was called later conversation piece, which is these portraits that are very specific to British art, where in fact you are no more in a formal and pompous way like the French like to do, but you are with your children, you are doing things that you do on the weekend, you are fishing, you are next to the pond, you are reading. It's no more something which is trying to elevate your status. And that are the conversation pieces, and Arthur Davis was the one who started the fashion of that. Then Alma Tadema, another one, but this time in not a piano, but the painting itself, and which is one of the masterpieces by Alma Tadema, bought in 1978. And then something that probably you notice less, but it is this acquisition by the Clark in 1997, this absolutely magnificent bust of Anton Raphael Mengs by this British sculptor called Christopher Hewitson. This is one of the really important portrait busts made by a British artist at the end of the 18th century. Mengs was a very famous painter. He was also one of the closest friends of somebody called Winkelmann, who is considered usually as the first art historian. But the two were strong protagonists in trying to resuscitate the classical state, the classical taste, sorry. And this bust is really one of the great acquisitions, I think, made in terms of sculpture at the Clark. Then arrived the tsunami, in a way, of Sir Edwin Manton and Sir Edwin and Lady Manton gift, for two reasons. We talked a lot about the opening of the Manton Research Center, and without their support, their gift, nothing, even the seats where you are sitting on, would be here today. Just to remind you, the reading room, the Manton Study Center for Works on Paper, the grad program, which is probably one of the best views you could have when you are studying, or not studying because you are looking at the view. The scholars' meeting room, some of the shelves, and I cannot resist on showing two things. It's two catalogs that I wrote, in fact, when I was here at the Clark. One is for about drawings on British drawings in a French collection in Paris, and the catalog of the Constable exhibition. It was the Constable selection was made by Lucien Freud, and I worked on this exhibition and this catalog when I was here at the Clark. I mean, my connection with the Clark and the British art is probably summarized quite well in this thing. These two catalogs. And I would like also, I'm taking 2 minutes to make a short homage to Giles Waterfield, who has been a fellow here 5 years or 6 years ago, but who visited the Clark a long time ago. He was one of my very, very close friends. He was one of the great art historians in British art. He was interested in very interesting and very strange subjects. Sometimes he did exhibition on portraits of servants. He was one of the great specialists of English museums. And he was also he has been the director of the Dulwich Picture Gallery, the first director of the Dulwich Picture Gallery. He was also the director of the Attingham Summer School, which is one of the great teaching institutions for British art, and he was also the director of the Royal Collection Studies. And he passed away a week ago by a heart attack. And yeah, I'm happy to see his smile today. But well, the Manton collection, a walk through landscapes. I think there is something which is very important to have in mind when you think about the Manton collection, is the fact that it is mainly and almost only a collection on landscape. And landscape in British art has been probably the most, well, British art landscape has been probably the most influential stream of ideas at the end of the 18th century and during the 19th century. I think the entire painting, the entire art history at the end of the 19th century would be extremely different without British art. Jay mentioned that the influence of Constable on British art has been extremely, on Impressionism, for example, has triggered the movement, and it's true. And the collection, the Manton collection, is probably for that one of the best collections we could have to study the landscape, the landscape painting history through the 18th and 19th century. Why? It starts very early. It starts with Gainsborough, and there is great paintings and drawings by Gainsborough in the Manton collection. And you have here one of the great works of art in the collection, which is this wooded landscape with a boy leading a monkey. Very influenced. The date is 1760s. Gainsborough was mainly a portrait painter, but he was also a landscape painter. And he was very influenced by the Dutch school, but he also was very open to look at the landscape itself. I mean, it was not repeating a formula. He was really going to into the wood around Bath. He was also doing things sometimes very surprising, and this is probably a landscape was made this way. He was going back to his house, and then he was on the table using cauliflowers, water to recreate landscape and to paint them. And many of his drawings were not made outside, even if he was going sometime outside, but many of them were also made inside. That is a beautiful drawing also from the collection. Then you could go through the landscape artistry through the collection with something that you could not see always on display, which are the drawings and the watercolors. The watercolor collection in the Manton collection is a large part of the collection. Just to remind you that, in fact, watercolor was not used so much until the mid-18th century, for technical reasons also. Dürer did some watercolors, but it was very complicated to mix the color, to use the water, and if you wanted to go outside, it was almost impossible. For technical reason, the apparition of new tools, new colors that were already prepared, the artist started to go outside and to be able to paint watercolor outside. Why watercolor was so important in the history of landscape? Because you were able to go outside, but you were also able to go to paint quickly, to do things in less than 15, 20 minutes. That means to catch the difference between a sky at 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. And this is also the moment the artists start to do not try to construct the landscape, to build something which resembles more a painting by Poussin than the real landscape. In fact, the tradition was to paint something which has been painted before. The tradition was extremely strong. Watercolor allowed painters to try to catch what was in front of their eyes in an amazing way. It was also the moment, and there is a lot of connection between the development of landscape painting and meteorology. In fact, when people started to look closely at skies, at clouds, how the weather was, the forecast, in fact, it was almost at the same time that they started to look at the sky and the landscape and to paint them. Well, here, Edward Days, probably one of the very first artists to use watercolor to paint landscape in a professional and successful way. Not a very, for what we know, not a very pleasant teacher, but a good artist. And he is more known now as the teacher of Goethe. Goethe was one of the great artists in watercolor. He traveled quite a lot, and this is one of his really great watercolor. This one too, quite different. I think Goethe left Days very early on. He was not very pleased. But he has been extremely successful. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 25 or 26. And Turner, who was one of his friends, said if Goethe would not have died, Turner would have starved because in fact he would not have been so successful with a competitor like Goethe, with a competitor like Goethe. Then another landscape by Goethe, 1800. And then you could go through the entire century, through the Manton collection, and you could do a sort of, you can do a textbook almost even with the collection. And you have John Martin. John Martin was an artist who has been also extremely successful, not only in England, but also on the continent, mainly through his prints. And for landscape, not really like this, but the sort of apocalyptic landscape. And this is a calm view of the British landscape by John Martin, but beautiful and very vivid colors by John Martin. And then you have Bonington in the collection. Bonington is the British guy, the English guy, who at the age of 16, 17 went to France with his parents. And it is through Bonington that the entire continent started to practice watercolor. And he's a very important artist for that. He's the one who is, in fact, making the link between England and, for example, Delacroix. Delacroix was a very good friend of Bonington. He was his closest friend. Bonington also died young at the age of 27 after a trip in Venice. But we have here, with the Manton collection, an amazing selection of Bonington. That is a view of Venice, the Rialto Bridge. Another artist which is represented in the collection, Samuel Palmer. Samuel Palmer was working with a group of artists in Shoreham in England, and they were interested by the relationship between landscape and faith, mainly, or spiritual aspect of landscape. And he had a long career, and this one is from 1862, but it's quite similar to the one he was doing in earlier years. And then you have people like William Cook, very dramatic sunset, and Albert Goodwin. Here now you are in Albert Goodwin died in 1932, which is quite late. I mean, you have this tradition going through the entire century for almost 2 centuries. The last one, which I like very much, which is Sinbad the Sailor, the same by Albert Goodwin, where you have this sort of fantasy vision, and you have here this very strange animal. Well, now we are going to the core of the collection, Constable and Turner. I start with Constable, who is younger than Turner, but I think he's also probably the one that Sir Manton was probably the most fond of, and I will try to explain why. Constable was born in a little town in what is called now Constable County, which is on the east side above London. And in fact, he spent his entire life almost there. He moved to London once. He was visiting his friend Fisher in Salisbury, but beside that, he was not at all interested in traveling. He never went out of England, neither, and when I say no, not out of England, I mean even not Scotland or Wales. And going to France was for him, but interestingly, Constable won an amazing reputation outside England. It's interesting to see that Constable was not traveling, was not interested by something which was not English, and in fact, he probably not very interested in anything which was not in what is now Constable County. But his reputation was outside first. He was better known outside at the beginning than inside. And he gained his reputation in Paris, poor him. And he won the gold medal in 1824 and had a second exhibition in 1827. And he sold the entire exhibition. The most important masterpieces by Constable were bought by French people before English people started to buy them. Well, we were not able to keep them so long because they were bought by 40 years later by English people. But interestingly, his impact on the French school has been amazing. The entire Barbizon school after that started to paint like Constable. They were interested by his deep interest in nature. He was not interested in ideas, he was interested by the nature itself. And this is the trend, the path to Impressionism, for sure. On the other side, Turner, who traveled almost everywhere in Europe. He went, I think if I remember, he went probably 13 times in Switzerland, 10 times in France, many times in Venice. He was a sort of unflattable traveler. He never gained success outside. And he never exhibited, for example, at the Salon in Paris. And he had almost no impact until the end of the 19th century on other painters outside England. It's a very interesting, because now we think that Turner is the most, the most spectacular of the two. But in fact, the one who had the most impact was Constable. And Turner was not very happy about that because he was a genius. He was a young genius. He was an academician very early on. He was, I think, an academician at 21 when Constable, with a lot of difficulties, started to be an associate academician when he was already 40 or 50. And Turner was always competing with him when the Royal Academy exhibition was going on. And there is a great story about this competition. Constable was quite shy, but Turner was not outgoing also. Put his paintings on the wall, and there was a big Turner painting representing a sea, quite gray. And Constable was on the two sides. There was painting by Constable on two sides that were beautiful, and people were looking at that. But it was not the moment of the opening. The night before the opening, as Turner was full academician, he was allowed to come at the last minute to varnish the painting. And he came, and instead of varnish the painting, he put a big buoy in the center of his sea painted red, which was so flashy that in fact it was almost destroying everything around it. And in fact, he ruined entirely all the effect of Constable with this red spot in the middle of his own sea. But here you have, I think, a great and beautiful example of Constable work. It's a sketch again, but it's this unending search of truth by Constable. Constable was working mainly, as I said, in a very tiny area. He knew everybody. His father was owning mills and fields. He knew everybody he was painting. He was probably knowing that is Hampstead Heath, which is a place where he lived near London. But it's probably the same. I mean, he knew everybody. He knew every single path. He knew every single road. And he was interested to render them as clearly and as purely as possible. But it's not always a pleasant painting. It's not something that comes to you easily. You have really to go deep in the painting. And collecting Constable is something which is usually done by people that are very involved in their collection. You do not collect Constable because it's nice on the wall. You collect Constable usually because it resonates in your heart or in your mind. But it's always about seeking truth or seeking the soul of a landscape. And these are famous sketches for painting which were far larger. This is a famous sketch by Constable representing Salisbury Cathedral. And you can compare that with the Clark Salisbury sketch. It's very different in spirit. The one at the Clark is really readable. This one is hard to read, rash. There is sort of a almost unpleasant aspect, but also very true. And the two are very interesting to see together. And that is also an interesting piece by Constable. It is his attention to detail. It's the study of a burdock, and it's probably a very small area, and he was trying to understand what he could do with that. And then after that, you have the skies, and you saw the skies we looked at previously, and the mention I made on the meteorology and the attention to the former clouds and this interest in trying to render every single moment in a day. And you have here 3 studies in the Manton collection. They are beautiful, very diverse, but also this sudden interest to trying to make, to be accurate. which was not the case before. There is also a scientific aspect in the Constable search. Salisbury, very beautiful drawing, great drawing. And this amazing letter with these sketches of the rain. It's like a Victor Hugo drawing. And then the finished drawing, a finished painting by Constable, which is the wheat field, which is one of the really masterpieces of the collection. And the sea, he went to Yarmouth, and this amazing Osmington Bay with sort of a very empty landscape. Turner, now. Well, Turner, there is two pieces in the collection which are, in fact, immediately telling you many things about the difference between Turner and Constable. This is, and Jay said that, this is inspired by Watteau, the first Rococo painter in France, who was painting ladies and men in gardens, playing theater, playing music, in fancy costumes. The idea that Constable could paint somebody in a fancy costume is far from Constable. And that is a perfect example of Turner. I mean, Turner is more about experimenting, about trying to imagine, also about seducing. This is also an interesting thing that Constable would never do. This is a view of India, Seringapatam. He never went to India. Turner never went to India. But well, it's good. It's fun. What Turner did, and that is also interesting, is at the beginning of his career, he made his income with topographical rendering. That means this is something also which is very specific to England. These painters and draughtsmen who were in fact going to see ruins or landscape, making portraits of architectures, making portraits of ruins, but also making portraits of a house, like you saw with the Constable that the Sterling Clark bought. That was a commission. And Turner started with that. I mean, he was very interested in accuracy in terms of details, but not in terms of spirit, in a way, interestingly. And then you have all these beautiful drawings or watercolors by Turner representing real landscape views that are accurately depicted in terms of topography. That is a view of Plymouth. That is a view of Weymouth. That is a view of Offa, which is in France. And that is a perfect example of what Turner was doing. He was traveling, he was coming back, he was making a lot of watercolors on the spot, then he was coming back, and he was usually publishing books on his travels. I mean, there was sort of an annual annual book showing his travels. That is also something in Germany, Italy, and these are Yarmouth boats, and these were made in like a sort of little vignette in books. And Genoa. But when I was preparing this talk, I was quite surprised to see that Sir Manton was not interested so much in this sort of Turner. He was not interested in the Turner we see, for example, in the Sterling Clark collection. I mean, the big Turner, which is a little bit crazy, with no real detail. I mean, what you see here, sky and sea, or this, which is sort of very blurred watercolors. In fact, he was more interested in accuracy, that means the aspect of Turner which was closer to Constable. And to my opinion, his interest in Turner was linked with Constable more than to Turner himself. And I think it's a very interesting collection also for that, not only for the fact that the collection is giving a splendid overview of landscape, British landscape through almost 2 centuries, but also because the collection is focusing on the 2 big masters in a way that is quite unusual. Yeah, and I put back again the Turner from the Clark collection, and you see the difference between this and this. I mean, there is no, in the Clark Turner, you have something which is very different, which is more about a dream than about the reality. And I will finish on landscape itself. I think the Manton collection in this case is provided the Clark an incredible asset to study landscape, which is also one of the identity of the Clark when you are talking about the Clark itself and the surrounding of the Clark. And some people were thinking that I would give you a vision for the next years. I think it's a little bit early for that. And I think it was more important for me to, and for my own pleasure, to go through the Manton collection, because we are also celebrating that today. But I think it's also an interesting link with probably what will be many of the topics of reflection for the next years. I think the relationship between the Clark and the landscape around, the importance of ecology, the importance of sustainability is quite interesting for the Clark. And I think we have all the assets to do that. And the Manton collection is providing one of the most beautiful of them. Thank you very much. If you have any question, I'm very happy to answer, if I can.
The book says that they lived modestly. Where did they store all the paintings?
Sorry, I think we will ask their granddaughter.
They lived in New York City in an apartment on Fifth Avenue. So modestly is within, reason. They could have lived much differently than they did. I mean, they had that apartment in the Village, which they loved because Calder lived in the basement and Dorothea Tanning lived upstairs and Maurice Sendak was in the building, and they were surrounded by artists in that community. They did have a beach house and they had a ski condo, but they didn't have a flat in London and a flat in Paris and a house in Bermuda where they could have. And the apartment was, a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment, and they had a room that he had, because so much of it is works on paper. So they had a storage room downstairs that most people would have used for books and things, and he had art stored away there. They had a room that was a dressing room, but there were racks there for works on paper and some of the watercolors. And then in his office, he also had a storage room. And so that's where we didn't, as a family, didn't see many of the works. There were some things like the cloud studies on the walls, a few things, but most of it was works on paper and they were stored away and we didn't see them much. So modestly is a little bit of a relative term, but for what could have been, they lived very modestly.
Thank you, Sandy. Any other question? Yep.
How did the Mantons get on with Paul Mellon?
Sorry?
Paul Mellon. How did the Mantons get on with Paul Mellon?
Well,
Sorry, Olivier, this one's mine too. So I don't actually know if they ever met, but my grandfather spoke of Mr. Mellon and his vacuum, and he was not a fan. When we were thinking of where the collection would go, there was obviously the possibility for it to go to Yale. There's a wonderful British art center there. My sister went to Yale, but we as a family knew that that wasn't something that he would ever have approved of, because he was, as Jay said in her talk, my grandfather was very private about his collecting. Mr. Mellon was not. They were two very different collectors.
any other question? Well, thank you. No, yeah?
Just quickly, are there plans now to show the works on paper from the Manton collection at any time soon?
Well, I think that is a question, I do not want to deflect always, but I think it's a question for Jay. No, I think as you know, the works on paper cannot be displayed on a permanent basis. The new space, the Manton space, is providing an opportunity to rotate more frequently and more easily and with more, I think it would be more pleasant for the public to come. And Jay is very fond of the idea that everybody could come and to see to ask to see one piece or another. But I think because of this rotating aspect, we cannot put that on display more than a certain number of days every 3 years, I think, yeah.
Hello, thinking back to the Turner exhibit that was so marvelously displayed here a number of years ago, is there any plans or indeed an ability to use the Manton collection as, shall we say, bait to be able to lure in other works, other British works, or perhaps in some kind of exchange or collaboration with a British museum or another collection?
I think there is no plan for the moment for a Turner exhibition or a British exhibition or British art exhibition for the moment, but we are at the very, very beginning of exhibition planning since I arrived. And but at the same time, I have to say that with the Manton collection, it gives us an amazing tool to, as you just said, generate exhibition, because you have the possibility of loans that we were not able to have before. The fact that we have all these works from the Manton collection is also giving us a lot of possibility to exchange, to work with people, other museums. I think the Tate, the Mellon, that these places are now our natural partners. Yep, Paul?